Opportunity Lab, or co-founding director of the Opportunity Lab and founding director of the California Policy Lab, which is an innovative partnership between policymakers and UC faculty to use evidence to improve programs and policymaking. Perhaps most importantly, Jesse holds the esteemed title of Friend of Demography. Jesse received his PhD in economics from Berkeley and was formerly on the faculty at Princeton, was chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor, and served on the Council of Economic Advisors. His research is in public and labor economics, focusing on education and tax policy to understand how public institutions, such as schools, affect inequality. On a personal note, I've also really appreciated and been struck by Jesse's generosity in support and mentorship that he's shown to me as a junior faculty member in a totally different department. So, thanks for joining us here, Jesse.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. This is actually a really well-timed invitation. It's been a long time since I had a paper that was as good a fit to a demography presentation. This paper all revolves around over-interpreting an H-time cohort decomposition.
We love it
I was thinking the last time I was estimating H-time cohort decompositions, I was sitting right through that wall under the stairs, and it was before we had ever heard of Harry Potter living under the stairs. This was my first year of grad school, so this is nice timing. Okay, I'm not the first person to notice that young people are doing badly in the last few years. This is a graph I took from a Leonhardt column about a month ago on the fleecing of millennials, showing that basically older people have been doing well, and it's partly that you see that among retirees in terms of incomes, but even among working age people, you see this gradient where younger people are doing worse. And you can also see that it looks like maybe a particular gap has opened up in the last few years after the recession. So what's driving this paper is a sense that as I talk to students who keep getting younger, they keep talking about how the experience that they've had since college just doesn't resemble what I remember after college. I graduated college in the late 90s when McDonald's was offering sign-in bonuses. And now I'm on the hiring end, and I hear and I look at what the process is for hiring, and we do 12 interviews and ask people to turn in 4 writing samples and do several exercises and all kinds of things that we can ask of workers because we can, and it's useful for the hiring process, and in other times you kind of had to beg workers to sit for one interview because otherwise they were going to go somewhere else. So it seems like something's going on with the experience of recent cohorts. So I've been kind of focused for a while on thinking that we had this Great Recession. The official statistic says the recession ended in 2009, but in the real world the recession didn't end anywhere near that soon. So this blue line is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate stayed high through 2011 and then kind of has fallen pretty steadily since then. And now it's at historically low levels, under 4%. But there's been, I think, good reason to think in the last couple of years, that the unemployment rate was overstating how good things were. If you look at the employment rate, or what I've done here is the non-employment rate, the share of prime age people who are not working, regardless of whether they're looking for work or whether they say they're actively searching, that spiked up also during the recession, and then stayed high for a long time and has only very gradually come down. And so at this point, it's still higher. It's still higher than it was before the recession. So we haven't fully recovered by prime age employment. Now there's a piece of this that's due to aging of the workforce, but there's not that much of it if you focus on prime age. It looks like the employment rate has been weak for a while. And so one of the questions that this raises is this because the recession did permanent damage? I think during the recession we worried that if it went on for too long, that there would be people who would be out of work for a couple of years, and then they would be permanently less productive. This is what gets called hysteresis. There are some models that say that you get permanent declines in productivity or employability from people who are out of work for a long time. If it's true, it's a major component of the cost of business cycles. DeLong and Summers have a paper a few years ago saying that for kind of plausible estimates of how much hysteresis there is, basically you can pay for the entire cost of countercyclical fiscal policy through the extra tax revenues you get from avoided for plausible estimates. You can disagree about what's plausible, but that's what they find. And so I think it's a natural question, is this what's going on? Is this why even though the labor market seems to be pretty strong right now, it seems like there is lots of labor demand. Is this why employment is still low? Because there are people who just, we damage them by having the market be so weak for so long, and they're not going to come back no matter what we do. This paper is going to focus on younger people for a couple of reasons. One, because their outcomes for young people have been particularly poor in the last few years, and so I think there's some reason to think that. Actually, the project started by looking at more demographic outcomes like family formation. The share of young people living with their parents is up like 10 percentage points since before the recession. Young college graduates in their 20s is up a lot. But I don't know how to estimate models of that kind of thing, so I'm going to focus on employment and earnings.
Does the cause of hysteresis matter for your talk? I mean, could it be that firms are adapting their technology or something like that, and it doesn't have anything to do with the damage to workers, just the economy has somehow been transformed by the Great Recession, and so there's not as much demand for workers? Or does that?
It matters a little bit, but I'm going to focus on relative impacts on young college graduates, who I think are the least likely subgroup of the population to become obsolete because technology changed, for example. And so everything is, for them, relative to older college graduates, where that might be more of an issue, and I'm going to, for the most part, set aside non-graduates. But I think it matters some.
And so during the recession, people went to school more.
Yeah.
I would expect that to be the opposite effects. I was just trying to imagine what's the story behind the hysteresis, what's happening to the individual worker that's making them.
If I have time, I'm going to show you that it doesn't look like there was a big recession effect on college graduation. There was an effect on any college, but most of those people didn't graduate. And it looks like there's been a relatively smooth increase across cohorts in the share with BAs. Through this period, it doesn't look like the recession seems to be that. But there's potentially a selection issue, and I'm going to worry about that we're getting different people into the college graduate pool. Let me put that off a little bit. Okay, so anyway, to some extent the reason outcomes have been poor is because the recession hadn't ended. But then they seem to still be poor even as the unemployment rate at least has come down. And I think it's pretty hard to look at today's labor market and say we're in a recession. You might argue we're not quite at full employment yet, and I would argue that, but we're not in historically bad times anymore, and outcomes still seem to be pretty bad. Okay, so this paper, as I said, I'm going to focus on new college graduates, with the idea that, for one, they're particularly vulnerable to long-lasting effects of the recession. If you're already in the workforce and you have a job, chances are you're not going to lose your job even during a really severe recession. Some people do, but most people don't. And that means you can ride out the recession. If you're a new graduate, you have to find a job. And if you're a new graduate trying to find a job in 2009, you're not going to find one. And so there's a reason why these people might have been particularly worse off. We also think that those first few years of the career are the important ones for building your long-run human capital. That you have to, the phrase is, you have to get your foot on the ladder. And if you don't get your foot on the ladder, you can't start climbing. And so maybe being out of work or having bad jobs in the first few years of your career it creates long-run consequences for your career trajectory. Another reason to focus on new entrants is I don't have to worry about retirement savings issues, which can affect some of the labor supply decisions of older workers. Okay, college graduates, their skills are unlikely to become obsolete over a few years, and we think career ladders are more important. We also think that if you look at non-graduates, we know that demand for non-graduates labor has been just falling steadily over a long period, and so if you have a 10-year gap between pre-recession and post-recession cohorts, the post-recession cohorts will be worse just because that trend has continued for 10 more years. We don't think that's happened for college graduates, and so I think that's less of a concern.
So I get why college graduates are sort of nice for these reasons, but do you also think that college graduates are behind some of the sort of stalled progression that you motivate this with? Like, are they the ones not having kids? Are they the ones?
So I'm going to show that in fact college graduates are not having kids and they're living with their parents, and actually their employment rate, I think it's the next slide, this one. So here I've got the employment rates this is for 25 to 30 and 31 to 54 by age without condition on education, and then I take the younger workers and divide them up into bachelors or not. And what you see is that everybody's employment rate fell during the recession. Younger workers are always more cyclically sensitive, and so they fell more than older workers. But then if you look at BA, non-BA, BA workers are more likely to be employed. That's not that surprising. But the non-BA, when the recession ended, they recovered. And the BA basically flatlined for a long time. So the BA employment fell 2 or 3 percentage points and stayed flat for 5 years after the recession ended, and has only relatively recently started to recover. And so I think there's some reason at least to think that there's something special going on with young graduates. In any case, another reason to focus on young graduates is that there's a long literature showing that early career conditions seem to have long-lasting effects on college graduates. So I'm going to be building off of that literature, which you can find similar effects for non-graduates as well, although it's attractive to kind of follow what other people have been doing. Okay. Okay, so what is the approach I'm going to take in this paper? Skip over all this because I've already said it. I'm basically going to estimate at age-time cohort decompositions that allow for there to be kind of lasting but not permanent effects of entry conditions, which are the kinds of things that people have estimated in this scarring literature. The scarring literature has generally found that the unemployment rate when you enter the labor market seems to have persistent effects on your earnings or wages or employment for, say, the first 10 years of your career, and then it seems to go away. So I'm going to build in the possibility of that into the model, but I'm going to notice that a lot of these models have treated the cohort effects as nuisance parameters. And it turns out the cohort effects are quite cyclical. So the cohort effects for people who graduate in recession, at least for employment, are lower than for people who graduate in better. That means that even once you allow for these scarring effects, people who graduate in recessions have permanently lower employment than people who graduate in better times, holding constant time effects and age effects. And that's going to turn out to be a quantitatively important part of the impact of the business cycle in this model. I'm going to decompose the damage into the 3 components, and I'm going to show that if you believe that these cohort effects are real, and to be clear, I'm going to treat them as permanent. We're going to have to wait 40 years to see if they really are permanent. It's hard to measure permanent effects on people who graduated college in 2010. But if you're willing to buy that extrapolation of this model, it says that this that cohort effect piece is basically half of the consequence of the Great Recession. That a third of it will happen after 2025. And that turns out, that's obviously quantitatively important for thinking about the costs. So that's going to be the basic. Data, I'm basically going to be stacking up enormous synthetic panels of CPS data. So repeated cross-section. So the main outcome I'm going to focus on is just whether you were employed last week from the basic monthly CPS. I'm going to stack up data from 1979 to 2018. I'm also going to show some evidence for annual earnings from the March CPS, only for people who worked last year, and hourly wages for people who worked last week from the outgoing rotation groups. I'm happy to talk at as much length as anybody wants about the details of CPS, but I think for the most part that's not what people don't know about this anymore, so I'll skip over that. Everything is going to be focusing on college graduates aged 22 to 40. Again, I want to abstract from issues about retirement savings. I'm only going to focus on relatively young workers, but focus on what's going on differentially for people at the younger end of that range relative to older. Sticking to people I see in 1979 to 2018, I'm going to limit to the birth cohorts of 1948 to 1995. So the 1995 cohort turned 22 in 2017. So you can't really look at more recent birth cohorts than that. For the most part, I'm going to index everybody by the year they turn 22. Because I think it's easier to keep track of which are the recession cohorts if you call people the 2009 cohort rather than the 1987 cohort. Some of the analyses I'm going to use, one of the concerns you have with estimating these models is that the recession was just such a big shock that if you try to estimate age effects, for example, that are homogeneous over a long period, the fact that everybody's doing badly in 2009 can make all the age effect, can pull all the age effects off. So in a lot of the analyses, what I'm going to do is I'm going to estimate the age-time cohort decomposition only using people who are already 30 by the time the recession hit, or almost 30. And then use those age and time effects to then hold them constant at that level, and then use those to estimate the cohort effects for the most recent cohorts. It doesn't turn out to matter very much, but it allows me to kind of force the recession to have the effect in the part of the model where I think it should. A big limitation is that I don't know when exactly people graduate college. If I'm going to stack up people from 22 to 40, some of the people who are non-graduates when I see them at 23, if I could come back to that same person 5 years later, they would be a graduate, right? Because there's lots of people who are graduating after 22. I also don't know when people graduated, and so I don't know which conditions were relevant for when they were first looking for a job. I'm going to kind of follow this literature and use the unemployment rate when you were 22 as my measure of your entry condition. There's some evidence that how long people wait to graduate is endogenous to the unemployment rate, so you wouldn't necessarily want to use their actual graduation year. 22 might be a little bit young, given that most people seem to graduate after that these days, but it's not too much. Most people do graduate by 24 or 25. But then there's also a sample composition issue, and so I'm going to include a selection correction term and try to persuade you that that fixes things. The basic model I'm going to estimate is, again, a simple age-time cohort decomposition. I'm going to stack data, collapse data into age-time cohort state cells. So I've got the employment rate for everybody of a given age in a given year from a given birth cohort in a given state. I'm going to regress that on age-time cohort effects, state fixed effects. I could do this all with national data, but it's useful to have the entry conditions be at the state level, so I'll do that. And then a selection correction term, which is basically a Mills ratio in the share of the cohort, share of the age-time cohort cell that has a BA. And in a simple selection model, that addresses the fact that the composition of the college graduates may be changing across ages. I also have some estimates where I limit the sample to only 25 and over, and that doesn't change things. Yeah.
I'm wondering, I mean, there must be some implicit, I suppose explicit assumption here about no interaction between the recession and the age or that sort of thing, since you're...
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, that's big.
This additive specification is a restriction, and this is one reason why I wanted to use this kind of holdout approach. That if you thought there was an interaction between the recession and age effects, then estimating the age effects on the whole sample would give you a different pattern than if you estimate only on the pre-recession group. And so that's one reason why I have this approach where I estimate it only on the pre-recession group, and then basically extrapolate those age effects and time effects to the more recent cohorts and figure out what's left of the cohort effects. And it doesn't change things very much, which makes me a little bit more comfortable with the additive structure.
Relative to estimating it without?
Relative to just throwing the whole data set in and estimating this model and not allowing for interactions.
But then you still have some identifying assumptions you must be making beyond that to be able to estimate it. Or is that not so?
Well, so there's a normalization. Is that what you're referring to? That you can't estimate
Maybe
each
you can
time?
explain
I'm thinking with the age period cohort.
Yeah, so there's, okay, so yes.
Okay.
You can't, you have to leave out one of each, and then you have to leave out one more, because they're not all identified. And so what I'm going to do is normalize there to be no trend in cohort effects between 1991 and 2000, and I'm going to try to be careful about interpreting everything as relative to the trend.
Yeah.
So that we can think of, basically we can't do simple differences, but we can do difference in differences because of this normalization.
Could you just explain it one more time for the general audience?
Sure.
So what is the identifying assumption?
Sure. Okay. So when you estimate age, time, and cohort effects, there's a fundamental non-identification problem that we could add a linear trend to the time effects and take one away from the cohort effects, and it would give you exactly the same predictions. So there's no way to perfectly decompose that. And you have to, basically what that means is in the regression, if you try to just put in a full set of age effects and a full set of time effects and a full set of cohort effects, instead of Stato just dropping one of them like it would in a normal fixed effects regression, it then has to drop one extra coefficient. And so rather than letting Stato decide what to drop, you decide what to drop. And so what I essentially do is I normalize these two to have the same cohort effect. Essentially you have to make some assumption about one of the linear trends. And so what I'm going to assume is that there was no linear trend in the decade before the recession in cohort effects. And again, I realize that's an assumption and not, and so I'm going to try to interpret everything relative to whatever the trend was during that decade.
And then this
Because
delta C will be a linear trend during the recession or after some date?
Delta C is a full set of cohort effects.
Okay.
It just can't, they're forced to be the same in these 2 years. It'll be a little clearer once I show the estimates. But because they're forced to be the same, all of my estimates you could just add a linear trend to or subtract a linear trend to, and I can't tell you that your version of it is worse than my version of it. And so I'm going to have to interpret it relative to whatever that trend, that pre-recession trend was. Okay. Now, this doesn't have the business cycle in it. this simple decomposition, the only way the business cycle shows up is this time effect. And you'll see the time effects really do look cyclical. The employment rates are lower for people when people are observed in 2010 than they are when people are observed in 2006. But we think that there might also be extra effects of business cycles. In particular, if people are permanently affected by early career conditions, what I'm going to be worried about is that the cohort effects themselves may be sensitive to conditions at the beginning of the career. That one of the things that may be driving whatever patterns I see in the delta C's is the conditions when you started. Okay, so the question I'm going to ask is whether delta C varies with the unemployment rate in the year you started the labor market. How cyclical is that? And then focusing more on the post-recession is delta C what's driving the bad conditions for young people in the most recent years? Does it load onto the cohort effects rather than the time effects, for example? Okay. We already talked about the selection. Sorry.
Do you measure anything else about the C's other than the economic conditions when they turn 22?
I'm not putting anything else up. I'm just going to put it in a sense where time series regression, wouldn't trust too much anyway if I tried to parse it out. But you can see it. It looks pretty cyclical. And so whether the unemployment rate is the right measure of the cycle, I think I could be agnostic. But there's clearly something about business cycles that's driving this. Okay. There's another issue here, though. If I'm focused on the most recent cohorts, I only see them when you're young, right? I can't tell what the 2010 graduates' employment rate at age 38 will be because I have to wait a while. And so what that means is there's something wrong with this additive structure where there are differential effects on young people of the recession relative to older people. That's going to load onto the cohort effects of the most recent cohorts, right? And so what I'm going to do is add terms to the model to try to capture what I'm going to call semi-transitory effects. So effects that might last beyond the immediate year, so they wouldn't be captured by the gamma t, but that don't last forever.
Is semi-transitory with age or with periods?
I'm going to try both. So
Okay.
let me show you. There's two different versions I'll try. One allows young people to be extra sensitive to the current conditions. As I showed you earlier, generally it looks like young people's employment falls more in recessions and recovers faster after recessions. And then another one I'll try, it will allow the initial condition to have extra effects on you for the first 10 years of your career that then go to zero afterward. And you can put both of them in, but there's not a whole lot of independent variation to identify them, so I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so here's just the pattern of age effects you get from this. The green line just has age and cohort effects and no time adjustments. The orange line is from the full age time cohort decomposition. It looks pretty reasonable. Young people have relatively low employment rates at age 22. This is all for college graduates. Employment rate rises quickly until you get to about 26, which is when most people are done with college and seem to no longer be doing their traveling around the world and trying to figure out what they're going to do with themselves. And then employment seems fairly steady, if anything falls a little bit over time. I should say, in everything I'm doing, I'm pooling men and women. And I think that's why this falls a little bit over the 30s as people start to have kids. Men and women stop working. Okay, time effects. Here's the time effects. They look highly cyclical. You'd be worried if they didn't. So the time effects, it just seems like being in the labor market in 2010 relative to being in the labor market in 2009 is worth about 3 percentage points lower employment.
These are essentially coefficients from that you just estimated?
Yeah, these are just the coefficients from model. Okay, the orange one is the coefficients, the green one is just the average employment rate without taking out cohort effects. And one thing you see is that the decomposition actually makes the time effects look less bad in the recession. This decline is not nearly as bad as in the orange line as it is in the green line. Maybe that's because partly what's going on with the bad outcomes in the most recent years is we've got new cohorts, and these new cohorts are worse. On the other hand, there is this linear trend issue that you have to be willing to take that orange line and tilt it by any linear trend over the entire time period, and you could tilt it downward a little bit and it would come closer to the green line, but it wouldn't close it all the way. Okay. And then...
Wouldn't it be exactly the green line? If I tilted it?
Not quite.
I don't mean
Think about tilting around this point.
essentially.
The gap over here is about 2 points.
Okay,
The gap over here is about 2 points.
okay.
But this is a lot closer than this.
Okay.
So it doesn't, I've tried, you can't close all of this without way overshooting over here.
Okay.
Okay. I guess the other thing I would say is it does seem to track fairly well for this decade. And any substantial tilt is going to make it not track so well over that decade. Okay. Okay, here are the cohort effects. The orange line doesn't have time controls in it, and then the blue line does have time controls. I've put green dots here to show the normalization here. That the fact that these are both 0 is not data, you gotta make some assumption. That's what I'm building into it. And what you see is that regardless of any normalization you want, is gonna show that there's a clear trend break around the post-recession cohorts. Maybe it happens a little bit earlier with like the 2005 or 2006 cohorts, but clearly they're doing worse relative to earlier cohorts than you were seeing in the time pattern beforehand.
Pre-recession.
Pre-recession, right? In the time pattern of the cohort effects. It looks, the way I've this normalization, one of the reasons I chose it is because it makes the long run pattern look pretty flat beforehand, but then you fall off a cliff in the recession. And the more recent cohorts have employment rates that are about 4 percentage points lower than the pre-recession cohorts.
It's actually falling rather before the recession, isn't it?
It starts to fall a little bit in the 2005 and 2006 cohorts also. That could be because age 22 is not really the right time to be measuring entrants. These are people who are 23 or 24 when the recession hit, and maybe they're affected. That's the right entry condition for them.
Is the way to think about this is that if we were to estimate an age curve for each cohort, it would slowly be shifting to the right, starting, say, 2000, and accelerating during the recession?
An age curve, so
I mean,
employment by age.
your
first curve, yeah.
age curve that you
Yeah.
had, it's kind of like moving to the right.
Less
And I think it's just moving down for these cohorts.
employed.
At any given age, these guys are less likely to be employed. Now, again, I can only see these people at young ages, but these guys at young ages are less likely to be employed than older workers were at young ages, even after you adjust for the fact that they're in a worse labor market. Okay. The other thing that's, I think, notable here is that there's no recovery at all after the recession. The people who graduated in 2015 are doing just as badly as the people who graduated in 2010. Again, if you want to think that the cohort effects were trending upward beforehand, then maybe this has started to recover because there was a change in trend here. But I think it's a stretch to think that the true cohort pattern was strongly positive in the period leading up to the recession. Okay, so that's the basic decomposition. Now let's augment it. And again, I mentioned there are two kinds of things that could be driving these bad cohort effects in the simple decomposition for the most recent cohorts. One is that if young people are particularly sensitive to bad conditions, in the recent cohorts, I observed them almost entirely in years in bad times, and so it might be that their age effects should be just that's basically a time by age interaction that I'm not accounting for, and it's showing up in the cohort effects. Another possibility is a cohort by age interaction, which is that it may be that if you graduate in bad times, you're worse off for a little while, but not forever. Because I'm only seeing these people for a little while, I'm not going to be able to distinguish those in this model, and I'm going to have to use earlier cohorts to identify the distinction there. Okay, so how am I going to do this? Let's start with the first one. I'm going to take the simple model, and what I'm going to add to it is interactions between the unemployment rate this year in your state and indicators for your age. Only including indicators for the first 2 years, the second 2 years, the next 2 years, all the way up to 10 years in the labor market. So any effect of the current unemployment rate on people who have been in the labor market for more than 10 years is going to be forced to show up in the time effect. Okay, and so, but what this is picking up is that bad times may be differentially bad for young people relative to older people. Okay, you have to add a little bit of complexity to deal with the fact that this is a state level unemployment rate and these are national level time effects, but it's not too hard to deal with that. You just have to put in the deviation of the state from the national unemployment rate and have that affect everybody. Okay, so the idea is that this is capturing differential effects of economic conditions on young people. And when you estimate that, you find that there are in fact that young people are more sensitive to economic conditions than older people. The 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate reduces the employment rate of the youngest graduates by about ½ a point relative to older college graduates. Not that shocking. Okay? And when you build that into the model, The orange line is the basic age-time cohort decomposition, and the blue line adds in this extra excess sensitivity, and it doesn't do very much. Right? That these people who graduated during these cohorts, maybe we were underestimating it a little bit, because partly they were doing badly in their first couple years because the conditions were bad and they were especially sensitive to it. But the fact that this wears off within 10 years, and mostly wears off within 5 years, means it can't do too much to explain why these guys have been doing worse every year of their careers, because we see them now, even after that, most of that is worn off. So it doesn't seem to change things very much to allow for that. The next thing,
About 10 minutes.
okay. The next thing you can do is allow for the possibility that there's kind of this, what I'm going to call semi-permanent scarring or semi-transitory scarring, depending on whether you think the glass is half full or half empty. Here, instead of putting the interaction of the current unemployment rate with your age, I'm going to put in the interaction of the unemployment rate when you were 22 with your age. With the idea that the unemployment rate when you were 22 may do damage to you when you're 22, 23, 24, up to about 30, but any damage it does that lasts beyond 30, I'm going to call a permanent effect and put that into the cohort effect. So the cohort effect is only capturing things that lasting effects of initial conditions, and this is allowing the initial conditions to have differential effects when you're young. Okay? And again, you see some evidence of that as well. That the employment rate for people who graduate in bad time, the unemployment rate when you graduate, when you're 22, seems to depress your employment when you're 22, 23, 24, 25, maybe 26, 27, but then it kind of seems to wear off in these specifications that people have estimated. Okay? And the orange dots is just estimating the model on the full sample, and the green series is using only the pre-recession cohorts that identify the time effects and then extrapolating. It doesn't seem to change the basic story very much. Okay.
Is this the same story that we just saw, the same feature in the data that we just saw with a different interpretation than the last, or is this?
Well,
Or can you say this is what's happening and not the
I
other
mean, to
one?
some extent, it's the same variation that identifies it.
Yes.
But what allows you to separate them is that the unemployment rate started to recover through this period, right? And so, if it's the scarring story, the fact that the unemployment rate recovers after I'm in the market doesn't help me any, because I was already scarred by my initial conditions. But if it's the excess sensitivity, then even though I'm young, I'm extra sensitive to the unemployment rate, that recovery of the unemployment rate helps me. And so that, there's a little bit of variation that identifies them separately. I don't want to say that they're super well distinguished, and if you put them both in, you get a lot of imprecision. If anything, it loads on to the excess sensitivity story rather than the scarring story, but I wouldn't want to, I'm not sure you could reject either one. It's mostly the same variation. Okay, so it looks like that wears off within about 5 years, but then if you look at the cohort effects are still falling off the cliff. Now it's a smaller cliff than it was before. That scarring seems to account for a third to a half of what was going wrong with these post-recession cohorts. But there's still a lot left. Okay, so the guys who graduated during and after the recession, they have lower unemployment rates relative to the pre-recession trend, even after you account for the fact that they're low for a few years. Okay, now you have to be a little bit careful because these guys were only seen for a few years, and so we're really relying on estimating those scarring coefficients from earlier cohorts and extrapolating them. But again, it seems like that's not so crazy. The other feature of using only the pre-recession cohorts is the unemployment rate in the current recession is much higher than it was previously. When I use the pre-recession cohorts and I extrapolate, I'm essentially assuming that this linear specification is right. And it doesn't have to be right, but it looks like it's not so crazy. It looks like you get pretty similar responses per percentage point increase in the unemployment rate before the recession as you do during the Great Recession.
But we have, if you go to the next slide, and we have other recessions that have happened during this period, and it doesn't look like there have been these permanent long-term
Well, you see
effects, right?
You see declines. The thing is, in other recessions, you see declines, and then the labor market gets better, and the cohorts after aren't affected by it. In this recession, the labor market stayed terrible throughout this period. And so maybe what you should expect is it should come down and then it should start to recover for the last couple of cohorts
Right.
where the labor market is better. And I admit,
But it makes you worry about the linearity assumptions a little bit, right? That
Yeah.
you're playing off the early
Yeah.
recession.
my inclination is to not take the 2015 and 2016 points too seriously. These are people who I don't see above age 24 yet. And, I've been working on this paper for a little while and those points have changed a little bit. So I added an extra year of data. There's just there's just not that much data yet for those guys. But it's true, it's not, you might think that things should have recovered for the last couple of cohorts, but probably not for the earlier ones if you think that the scarring story is the right one. Okay, so if you just take those cohort effects and regress them on the unemployment rate when you were 22, just trying to measure how cyclical these cohort effects are. So this is a time series regression. I've done what I can to correct up the standard errors for series correlation, but it's still just time series variation. You get a pretty big coefficient if you just take the raw cohort effects. Once you allow for this scarring, you have that coefficient. But here's where I say, it seems like if you put both of them into the model, it's the excess sensitivity that drives things. If you put both of them into the model, you're back to where you were before. So it looks like this scarring that people have focused on in the past maybe explains half of the sensitivity of recession cohorts, but there's another half that seems to be left. And maybe it doesn't explain any of it at all because it looks like it's not so robust to allowing for both of these effects. If anything, this time series regression understates how badly the most recent cohorts have done. If you try to use this to predict the change in trends after the recession, it predicts that the 2010 cohorts will be worse relative to the 2006 cohorts, relative to the prior trend, but it doesn't predict them to be as much worse as they have turned out to be.
But that prior trend was already, in pre-recession, the trend was already down, is that?
So what I'm using as the baseline here is 2002 to 2006. Yes, so I'm already taking
It's
out
already
this. I'm trying to
really
ask
going
relative
down.
to that.
And then it gets even steeper.
Yeah.
But it's already
Yeah,
really
so-
different from 90 to 2000. Well,
Do
I
you
guess-
want me to use this as a baseline?
No, well,
I
that's
could,
the whole
but
thing.
then it's not the recession anymore. It's harder to tell a story about what's going
What's
on
going on there? Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought I was being conservative by
No.
taking out the already downward slope. Okay. Let me talk quickly about this. If you look at different dependent variables, if you look at earnings conditional unemployment, I don't really find any evidence that either the cohort effects are cyclical or that we find this early career scarring in earnings conditional unemployment. Now there are selection problems if you look at earnings conditional unemployment. One, when you have the employment rate changing, that's worrisome. The most recent cohorts, actually, their earnings went up relative to earlier cohorts. So they seem to be doing pretty well. And if they're working, they're earning a lot. But again, there's a selection. Hourly wages, there's more evidence that hourly wages are cyclical. The people who graduate in recessions do seem to have lower wages for permanently. But at least some of that seems to be coming from, they have permanently lower wages for the first few years and then at least some of that wears off. But again, if you look at the experience of the Great Recession people, the 2009 cohort has really low hourly wages, but then cohorts after 2009 seem to have recovered. So that this kind of long-lasting effect that we're seeing across a lot of cohorts in employment, you don't see in wages. In general, non-college graduates, things don't seem so cyclical for non-college graduates. At least the cohort part of the non-college graduate piece doesn't seem so cyclical. It doesn't look like initial conditions have as long-lasting effects for them. Okay, but certainly their employment and their earnings both fell a lot during the recession. Okay, I promise I'm almost done.
Yeah, well, that's fine.
Okay, so then I want to take these estimates and try to add them up and try to see how the three different pieces of the way recessions can affect people in this model, how important are they quantitatively. So the three pieces are the time effects, or just immediate effects that then go away as soon as the recession ends. Then there's this semi-transitory scarring, which is that if you entered in a bad time, you're going to be worse off for the first few years of your career, but then that wears off. And then there's a permanent effect, that the cohort effect is permanently lower. So I'm going to think of this as short-term, medium-term, and long-term effects of recessions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take what the actual coefficients say happened to the post-recession cohorts, and I'm going to construct a counterfactual where there was no Great Recession. And the way I'm going to do that is going to assume that in the Great Recession cohort, the Great Recession ended in 2014, and from 2015 onward, there are no more business cycles. If there is no in the no recession counterfactual, I'm going to assume that that the year effects have just been constant from 2008 onward. So that the catastrophe that happened didn't happen in that counterfactual. The cohort effects, I'm going to assume that there's no downward trend after 2014 cohorts, which could be right or could be not right. It looks like the evidence is that these 2015 and 16 entrants are worse off than the 2007 cohort. But I'm going to assume that that's not true. And then in the counterfactual, there's no decline in the cohort effects. So we'll see what this looks like. I'm going to assume that everybody enters the labor market at 22 and retires at 65. You all can tell me how wrong that is, but I think it makes things a lot more complicated. I have to keep track of cohort sizes in this as well. Okay, so here's just kind of what I'm thinking of, what are the actual and counterfactual. The green line is the actual estimated year effects up to 2014, and then 0 thereafter, for the year effects. And then the orange line is just, let's shut off the Great Recession, which is this big decline in recovery, and hold it flat thereafter. Again, the green line is the cohort effects that seem to fall off a cliff, and then I'm going to assume in the counterfactual that after the recession, for the most recent cohorts, it recovers to where they were in 2007. Okay, and then the counterfactual, there is no decline during the Great Recession. Okay, this is just trying to get a sense of the magnitude of these different effects. And what you'll see is that the year effects show that everybody who was in the labor market in 2009 saw a decline in their employment rate of about 1.5 percentage points. The cohort effects say that everybody who entered the labor market in 2014 has a permanent 4 percentage point decline in their employment rate. You can already see that's going to be big in magnitude relative to this thing. Even though it's a smaller number of people, it lasts for a long time. This is a larger number of people, but it's over instantaneously.
I'm sorry, I just don't understand the
Yeah.
setup. On the right, the cohort effects.
Yes.
The dashed green line is what? What does it represent?
So the solid green line is data,
Yeah.
and then I have to assume what's going to happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And in the future, I just assume it's going to be 0 there after 2015, or the same as it was in 2007.
Okay.
And this is just having to connect these two.
But the way you just said this, it sounded as if one thing you were going to present was what would happen if it stayed at minus 4%.
No, I'm going to say that just the fact that these cohorts
Fine.
got the minus 4%, but they're going to carry that with them for
They're
the
going
rest
to
of
carry
their
it.
lives.
And in the year case, they're not going to carry it.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Entrant cohort, I think.
Okay, so here's what happens to the year effects. If this is just the same graph you saw earlier. If you integrate out the gap between the actual and the counterfactual series, what you see is that we lost 6.4 percentage point years of employment for college graduates during the recession, just for these pure year effects. Okay, that's fairly large. It's obviously because this is the part that goes away as soon as the recession ends, and I'm assuming the recession ended in 2014. All of this damage is done in this 7-year period between the beginning of the recession and the end. Here are the cohort effects. The cohort effects, because it's only a couple cohorts that are carrying them with them, they don't depress the overall college graduate employment rate that much at any given time, but they depress it for 40 years. And so if you integrate that out, that adds up to 7.3 percentage point years, with most of that happening way out here. Again, this is the period when the 2007 entrants are now in their 40s and 50s, but their employment rate is still lower, if you believe this extrapolation. Okay, here's what you get if you focus on the scarring effects that have been the focus of the literature up to date. This part that fades out over 10 years. Those aren't that large to begin with, and they fade out pretty quickly, and so it only adds up to about 1.8 percentage point years. It lasts a little bit after the recession ends. But construction, it can't last past 2024, and the estimates show that it mostly is over 5 years by 2019, 5 years after the recession ends. And then if you add all three of them together, what you get is that the cumulative effect of the recession is 15.5 percentage point years, which is to say that the part coming through the cohort effects looks like it's about half of the total effect. And a third of the total effect is things happening after 2025. So it looks like the potential, at least, is that what the estimates we can make thus far is that there is this long-lasting damage, and it's a big piece of the consequence of the recession. So I will stop there. Recent cohorts have done badly, it's not surprising, but even as the market has recovered, youth employment has lagged, and then as best as we can tell from models that only use data through 2018, it looks like there is a permanent consequence for these cohorts. come back in 10 years and tell you whether it looks like it seems to have persisted the way the model says it will, but it seems like that's what's happened in past cycles. And then if you take the DeLong and Summers calibration, where they basically try to say, how big does this hangover effect have to be to pay for the cost of fiscal stimulus, they have a parameter which is basically the magnitude of the hangover effect. They come up with a break-even point of about 0.025. If the hangover effect is bigger than that, then fiscal stimulus is self-financing. And this looks like it's in that rank, in that ballpark.
What's the time frame there? Per year, per?
Well, ADA.
Because your thing goes out to 2060
So
or
their ADA is the permanent decline in output per moment.
Okay.
And I convert my 40 years into permanent equivalents to try to figure out what the
But it looks like then it's about 0.25%.
Right.
Something like that. Your thing is very small.
So I get about a 0.025 when I try to convert this into a corresponding ADA.
Well, you said like, what was it, 15%? If you took that over 60 years, that would be?
Yeah, so 7.3 percentage point years on a, so that's a decline of
50 years. It's hard to know what the
yeah.
denominator should be, really,
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I take the baseline employment rate and I ask how much has employment fallen in percentage terms in each year of this, and then I convert this into a permanent equivalent.
Yeah.
Maybe I've done the math wrong, but I'm pretty sure 0.025 is what you get when you do that. You know, it's 7.3 percentage points, not on a base of 100%, because it's on the base of about 65 or 80%, because that's the college graduate employment.
Oh, I see, okay,
So that
helps. But still, there's a factor of, well, anyway, it's not.
I'll check the math, but yeah. Okay, let me just show you one graph while you ask questions, just because I think this is interesting. This just shows for 25 to 26-year-old college graduates, the share who are living with their parents, who are married, who are living with a spouse or partner, and living with their children. The share who are married has risen by 10 percentage points over the last 15 years. Okay. Sorry, living with their parents has risen by 15 percentage points. Married has been declining steadily, but it's fallen a lot. Living with a child has fallen by about 5 percentage points from the Great Recession cohorts. Some of this may be delaying, but these are big effects that somebody who knows how to, is better at models of, kind of survival models than I am. But these are worth following up, but I'll stop here.
Is it useful to think of this in terms of lost GDP as well? Is that easy to get back? I mean, using those, you have fiscal stimulus.
Yeah.
But if people are continually unemployed, that's not happening.
That's basically what the calculation is for that ADA I was just talking about. Is that that's lost output,
Yeah.
and that means it's lost tax revenue because we're not collecting taxes on that output.
But can it, I mean, just as
Yeah.
another way of looking at it, is it easy to get the percentage GDP from that ADA, or is?
I think the ADA you could interpret. I mean, it's all very stylized, but you can interpret that as the percentage loss, percentage permanent loss in GDP per 1 point output gap now.
Right, so big.
Yeah.
This is marvelous, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. So I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to think, how do I think about a 4% decrease or lower employment over the course of a cohort's entire life? Should I
Right.
think of this as they're more likely to be out of work briefly, repeatedly? It's not 4% of them will never work? Or how do I think about what that looks like in the life cycle of a person?
That's a really good question, and one that I can get nowhere on with the CPS data. You need panel data to be able to see that. I think we think it's going to be some combination of people who are out for a good chunk of their career, and then some people who are bouncing in and out more. But it's pretty much, that's speculative. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I have that question, but then my other question really is beyond your paper. It's what's happening between these two recessions? I mean, that's where all these trend lines really begin, it seems, including for the household composition, but also for the unemployment trends. And is that the powering of the .com?
So there's a lot of evidence that what looked like a recovery during this period wasn't really a recovery.
Yeah.
Lots of things didn't seem to come back the way they should have, and the market was pretty weak for most of it.
Okay.
So I think some of this could be consistent with that. It just, this period was actually not such great times.
Debt, household debt, and
Household debt, but employment rates didn't recover as much as you would have thought from the post-2002 recession. Job openings didn't recover as much. Well, actually, that's harder to know because we don't have a series big one that far. Josh.
So my question is about the state effects, and maybe this is what you're doing and I just don't see it, but is it true that states that had a worse recession, let's have two states, one has a bad recession and the other not such a bad recession, and today they're both doing equally well, that the 30-year-old is doing worse in the place that had the worst recession? Is that the kind of identification you're already doing?
That's what's identifying the kind of early career parts, but that's not what's identifying the cohort effects, because the cohort effects I'm using only national time series variation for those. And arguably I should use the between state variation as well.
Do we get any, is your paper a what-if paper, where if this lasts forever then we'll have, or is it showing us that there's some evidence that it could last forever?
I guess I would say that it's showing the kinds of specifications that we have used in the past to try to understand these things imply that it will last forever. We don't know, this is not, all these specifications are approximations, but it's not obvious. I can't see anything obvious missing from the specification that would imply that it will recover faster than the specification is saying.
So my last question is just kind of a purely methodological question, but have you tried doing the whole analysis, say, ending in an earlier year, and do you get the same kind of loading onto that lower right corner with the young recent people? I mean, when we do this for fertility, very similar models, it's just big problems with the end of the data, because everything gets loaded onto the young people.
Yep.
And of course, we've been doing this last 10 years when the end of the day is really interesting.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we did was we went back and say, did 1995, and saw, are we getting also the same downward trend in 1995 as a way to see, is this just kind of the nature of
Right.
what happens?
Right, and so I guess what I would say is, to some extent, that's what these little blips and all the other recessions are. These are kind of roughly the right proportional size to this one, if you think that the magnitude of the unemployment rate, the change is measuring how severe the recession is. And to some extent, that's this exercise of.
But I guess what I'm saying is, if in 2000, say, probably not the best time to choose, but 1992, say, or 1993, you pretend that you only see the cohort.
right.
You don't see the future data, so you have the same truncation issue.
So I just cut off all data after 2000.
And you just estimate the same thing, and then
Yeah.
you're not going to get the same time trend, because this
Right.
time trend includes what happens after that.
Yes.
And then you can kind of see, wait a second, this really is different.
Right.
This is the truncation bias.
So I haven't done the analysis where I don't use any data after 2000. I just don't have enough data before that to be able to get very far. But I have done the analysis where I only use people who turn 22 by 2000. So I allow the Great Recession to identify what's going on in time effects and age effects for them, but I'm not using, but all of those scarring coefficients are based only on people who entered the labor market before 2000, so they're based on these earlier cycles.
Yeah.
And again, you don't see that those are wildly different when you use the earlier cohorts or when you use all the cohorts. Sorry, this is using the earlier cohorts and this is using all the cohorts. They're somewhat different, but they're not wildly different.
So I have 3 questions, and I'll just state them quickly, and then you can answer any or none,
Okay.
or whatever. So one thing that's going on over the periods, pretty much the period since the Great Recession, or starting with the Great Recession, is massive, with aging of the labor force, so a lot of exits at the old age, which I would otherwise have thought are going to be sucking in all these young workers.
Right.
So that doesn't seem to be.
Doesn't seem to be bad.
Another demographic change, of which I'm less confident about the timing, is the strong drop in teen fertility, adolescent fertility, which is going to affect those family variables you're looking at. Like it may be a good thing that marriages, there are fewer marriages or partners living together or whatever, to the extent that those are due to teen pregnancies and so on, lives with child, all of those things. So, and the last thing is, so what we see is a sort of equilibrium employment between what young people want to do and what their characteristics are on the one hand and what employers are looking for on the other. And it's hard to know, can't think of any story about why employers would, why it would be on that side. But on the side of the young, it might be interesting just to think about what's happening to unemployment rates for the young, because if they're out there looking for jobs, then at least the scarring isn't all on the side of, discouragement or deciding to be stay-at-home dads for the rest of their life, or moms, or whatever. And then maybe it's more on their characteristics, the desirability for employers or something.
Yeah, so I think that's a good suggestion. I should look at the unemployment rate piece. I'm not sure that will tell us that much about desirability for employers. It's clear that there's some gap going on in the last few years between what we're measuring as unemployment and who's really looking for work or interested in work or something like that. There's something going wrong with the way we measure it. There are lots of reasons why you could think that the nature of the changes in the labor market make our 1940s measures of job search not really the right measures for what job search means today. But there's some reason for that, to think of that. But so I'm not sure I would want to assume that it's necessarily employer side. One thing I've heard when I give this paper is, well, millennials just don't know how to hold jobs, and that's what's going on. But of course, that could be a version of the scarring, is that if you don't get your foot on the career ladder, you don't learn what it means to have a career job. What is it? The drop in teen fertility is a really good question. I am not enough of a demographer to have dug further than just doing the.
Well, you see, here it goes from 15% to 10%, so it's a third drop in
the share of people
for fertility. I mean, it's a huge drop in fertility.
This is the share of people, 25 to 26 college graduates who are living with children. I don't want to say that's fertility because it could be whether they're also less likely to be living with a partner. And but yes, you could do something much closer to the fertility version of this graph, and I think it will show a large decline. And then the last thing about old people retiring that should suck in young workers. Remember, I'm comparing younger workers to people in their late 30s, as the oldest people in my sample. So it's possible the retirees are sucking in the people in the late 30s, and that's making them do better relative to the young workers. So that's not an impossible story for what's going on here. Yeah.
Have you considered looking for an industry effect?
I have, but haven't done it. I'm cutting the data pretty thin here, but I could do some work on this. Industry stories are a lot easier to tell for non-college workers, where we kind of see big industrial shifts. Our industry data is just not that good for understanding what college graduates are doing. But there's more we could do. Done a little bit of work on occupation. It doesn't look like there have been big changes in kind of if you assign everybody the mean earnings of their occupation from some prior year, it doesn't look like there have been big changes in the occupation distribution for these workers.
It's two questions. One is, have you done this for other subgroups, for example, by gender and other demographics from CPS? And second, just getting back to the selection issue, the selection into college graduation. I know you said there's a lot more folks who are starting college but not graduating, but I'm just curious to see what the trend lines are in terms of the college graduation. I know you try to correct it with the Mills ratio, but identification is always hard with those.
This is my favorite slide, but it's way too complicated to explain, so I wasn't going to be able to do it. I take every cohort, and I take the share of them with a bachelor's degree when they're 22, up and follow the cohort through to when they're 30. And so the beginning of each line is when the cohort is 22, the triangles are when they're 24, and the circles are when they're 30. So there are a few things here that have nothing to do with this paper. One is there's this huge increase around the the early 90s entrants. So people who were born in, I guess, the late 60s. Huge increase in the share of them who get bachelor's degrees after 24. This is the lengthening of college that I think has been written about, but it looks like it's a one-time shift. And then the lines move in parallel afterward. The other thing you see is a big increase in the overall attainment rate across cohorts, but it looks fairly linear over this period. It's really hard to see a recession effect here. Except maybe you can see that the people who graduated in 2010 have a higher rate of getting bachelor's degrees in their very late 20s, but we need to wait a few years before that's still one data point, and I don't want to take it too seriously. But other than that, what I see here is basically linear increase in attainment after after around here, it looks like it's all showing up before 24. You don't see any increase in attainment after 24. But I've been staring at this graph for way too long, so maybe I'm over-interpreting it. If you make a graph of the share with some college, not the share with BAs, there you do seem to see a trend break at the recession. It looks like a lot of people were pulled into some college by the recession, but it doesn't look like it's hard to see a recession effect on.
The story I heard from David Canning on this is that there is a big increase in college for these cohorts, but that a lot of it is this private University of Phoenix. A lot of the number of people graduating from the existing schools has stayed the same. So a lot of the growth is in these diplomas that we're not so clear what their value is.
Right, I believe
So
that.
I think they're getting the credential, but maybe they're not getting a credential that's worth as much.
That could be.
And so our
Yeah, certainly in the CPS, you can't tell where their grade is from. But again, it doesn't look like there's any differential change in the recession. It looks like there's just been this smooth but big trend.
Right, it
over
fits,
here.
that makes me worry about interactions with everything else that we're
Yeah.
identifying.
Yeah.
But I don't know what else we're doing.
Right.
From bricks and mortar schools.
Okay, I'm way over time, so.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
I have one more question from the people intimately affected by this.
So your other question about demographics, I have done it for college and non-college, but I have no other questions.
I think the gender one.
Yeah.
Particularly fascinating.
Last chance, going once, going twice, thank you.